Hi all, hope we've been staying safe and well. Today what I'd like to have a look at with an Inspector Calls is having a look at the idea of changes across the play. Now this is a significant idea that we might want to consider when looking at exam technique, because for an examiner what they're considering is your understanding of the whole the play as a whole, as a construct, not just necessarily small parts or small chunks of it. So it's important to track changes and developments in characters, their attitudes, their beliefs, or lack of changes in a character across the play. So this video is going to consider each of the characters separately. It's going to look at a couple of key quotations for each of them to show how their attitudes either fluctuate and change or whether they remain the same. I hope it's really useful, and obviously there's my full plan looking at all of the characters together right at the very end. Okay, so one of the ways of approaching an Inspector Calls is looking at the structure of the play. Now, it's quite a significant structural choice that Priestley's done, and we talked about it previously when we looked at the idea of it being a crime narrative, where each character has their own specific interrogation with the inspector, and we get a lot of time focused and devoted to each character, where they can explore their values, their beliefs, their views on society and on this murder as a whole. So what I've chosen to do when looking at my plan is have a look at a quotation or a few quotations pre-interrogation or at the very start of their interrogation, and then moving on to looking at a quotation from after the inspector has left. So what impression has he made upon this character? How has this character absorbed his message and become more malleable, or have they remained stoic and immovable and not changed in the slightest? So what we're going to see in the plan is, in blue you'll have the quotation from either before the inspector arrives or the start of the play, when he hasn't begun their interrogation properly, and then in green you will have the quotation from the end of the play where any changes have occurred. Okay, so central to my argument when looking at changes is actually what new information do the characters receive and what is the potential influence on them to make a change. Now we know as an audience that Priestley, as his socialist message, is trying to challenge the views of capitalism. He's trying to explore the values of social responsibility and individual responsibility, the fact that he views society as an interconnected body in which we are all playing a part. So what I've done for the central sort of core message is I've looked at the inspector's key lines here. So we have that each of you helped to kill her. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. We will be taught in fire and blood and anguish, and that there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. These are Priestley's core messages, that we do not live alone, that as a society we have responsibilities and privileges, and therefore we should be looking out for the weakest members of society. Now these quotations are core to Priestley's ideas and values. Obviously we know that the inspector, being Priestley's mouthpiece within the play, is his voice. This is the teachings that he's trying to impose upon his characters. These are the changes in which he's trying to impart to them. So important quotations to remember, important quotations to look at, and be able to memorize these as important points to bring up in an exam piece. Okay, so the first character we're going to consider is Mr. Birling. Now, this is a character who probably has the most to say before the inspector arrives. So therefore we can view him almost as the antithesis, the exact opposite of the inspector's values. He spends a lot of time talking about his political beliefs, about his views on society and his views on the world. He is, at the start of the play, trying to teach Eric and Gerald about the capitalist views of the world. So for his quotations, I went for his initial points of view as unsinkable, steadily increasing prosperity, community and all that nonsense, and the way some of these cranks talk. So we have his sort of unfailing belief in the capitalist system with it being unsinkable, the fact that he cannot see anything apart from steadily increasing prosperity, emphasising his greed and his desire to consume. We have the fact that he views community as nonsense, and he views the socialist values of the inspector before he arrives as cranks, and the way that some of these cranks talk. Now in green, we have his reactions and potential changes later on in the play. Now, as soon as Mr. Birling is offered an out, as soon as he's offered a way to excuse his behaviour, he exclaims, "By jingo, a fake." So that's quite an important quotation to consider, that we know that he's trying to excuse his own behaviour, he's trying to excuse what he has done and trying to justify it. And when Sheila and Eric demonstrate some changes and they're trying to adapt their beliefs, he calls them the famous younger generation who can't take a joke, so that people who are willing to listen to this socialist message are being treated as idiots or being treated as beneath him. So ultimately, Mr. Birling doesn't make the sort of changes that Priestley is hoping for through his socialist message and through the inspector's interrogation. Okay, so the second character we're going to consider is Sheila. Now, Sheila's views on the world and views on society at the start of the play are in stark contrast to her views at the end of the play. So Sheila is one of these characters who develops a huge change, and develops and matures as a character. So for initial quotations I went for, was she young, pretty, the stage direction, rather pleased with life, and, "Oh Gerald, isn't it the one you wanted me to have?" So what we have here is Sheila's initial obsession with material values and material goods. We have the one that you wanted me to have, showing that she is submissive to Gerald, she is submissive to his values and his desires. And the ring in itself is a symbol of Sheila's ties to capitalism and ties to those values. We have the fact that she's described as rather pleased with life, a naivety that she doesn't understand how other people suffer and how other people have different values or beliefs and behaviours. And the fact that the first question she asks when the girl has died is, was she young, pretty? Again, emphasising her obsession with material goods and material values rather than human life and human empathy. Now, at the end of the play, in green, what we have is Sheila's change in the way that she matures and becomes more sophisticated across the play. We have, these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people, challenging her father, something she would never have previously done, and understanding how the capitalist way of viewing people as labour is a complete atrocity that she cannot support that anymore. At the end of the play, she doesn't try to excuse her behaviour, and she repeatedly uses the phrase, "It frightens me the way you talk." The fact that she is unable to excuse what she has done, and she even midway through the play says, "I'm really responsible." We see her language becoming more sophisticated. Rather than referring to her parents as mummy and daddy, she refers to them as mother and father, a sense of growing maturity and a growing experience. So Sheila is one of these characters who absorbs the inspector's message. Mrs. Birling even reflects, "You've made quite an impression on my daughter." So she's changing and developing into a more sophisticated character. The next character we're going to consider is Gerald. Now, Gerald's a bit of a funny one in the fact that he sort of straddles the two generations, and he sort of has a foot in both camps, if you like, in the oppositions between the Birling family. He's partially a member of the younger generation with his ties to Sheila and his sort of social ties to Eric, if you like. And then he's also trying to mature and become a man like Mr. Birling and into that generation. And Gerald's is sort of the halfway house. He might represent the people who are open to change but then ultimately refuse it, because ultimately the decision that Gerald makes is that he doesn't accept the inspector's message and that he is aligning himself more with Mr. Birling's values and beliefs. So from the start of the play, we have Gerald describing the women of the town as hard-eyed and dough-faced women, and the fact that he sees himself as an innocent, he sees himself as, "I don't come into this suicide business." We have his own sense of arrogance. Like he tells Sheila that she can drink to him, and he's repeatedly described as clever. He's described as by Mr. Byrne, "You're just the sort of son-in-law I always wanted." So we have this impression of Gerald as a man about town, someone who is well known, someone who can is enjoying the fruits of capitalism, if you like. He's enjoying his social status. Now, once he is interviewed by an inspector, we do initially see some forms of change. He is upset and he seems to have some genuine care for the girl he knew as Daisy Renton. He actually asks to excuse himself to go for a walk because he's rather more shook up than he might appear. However, once he finds out that Inspector Gould isn't a real police inspector, then his attitude again flips and changes. He doesn't accept the responsibility for what he has done and he tries to excuse himself. He says, "What about this ring, Sheila?" offering Sheila the chance to reconnect and just continue as if nothing's happened, of course, which Sheila refuses. When Sheila challenges him and says, we all helped to kill this girl, the girl does not alter the fact that the girl has died. He says, "Did we? Who says so?" So he isn't reflecting on his behaviour, rather he's reflecting on the consequence. Just because the girl that he knew might not have died, it excuses his behaviour. And Gerald ultimately is offered the chance to change, but chooses not to, which is important. The next character we're going to consider is Mrs. Birling, again another member of the older generation, and she shares lots of the values and beliefs of Mr. Birling. She's described in the stage directions as her husband's social superior and a rather cold woman. She exemplifies the sort of upper class detachment from people and detachment from empathy and detachment from emotions. So in blue we have Mrs. Birling's key quotations at the start of the play where she describes girls of that sort. She's described as a rather cold woman, and she can't understand how someone from a lower class would have ridiculous airs and scruples, as if people from lower classes have no value, they have no morality, and they wouldn't be expected to behave in the same way. Mrs. Birling checks her husband's behaviour. So when he's saying about thanking the cook, Mrs. Birling says, "You shouldn't say such things," trying to reel him back in. She's very much embedded in the capitalist philosophy of superiority and arrogance, if you like. Now, once she finds out about her connection to Eva Smith, she says, "I didn't know, I didn't understand." And Eric challenges her with, "You didn't even try." Now, after the inspector leaves, before the inspector leaves, she even says, I've done nothing I'm ashamed of. I've done nothing wrong, and you know it." So she's, even when confronted with evidence about her behaviour, she doesn't change. She isn't changing. We can see how this is an unmovable person in her morality and her beliefs. When the inspector leaves and she finds out about this, she says, "You've argued this very cleverly, Gerald." She's looking for an excuse to be able to excuse her behaviour and to go back to the way things were before. She is very defensive of Eric and tries to go back to the way things were. So we see a character who doesn't make this change and can't accept what she has done and how it might have affected another human being. Okay, the final character we're going to consider is Eric, and he's the final character to face interrogation, and it can be argued that it's fairly easy to argue that his crime against Eva Smith was the worst of all. His aggressiveness, his anger, his violence, and his sexual predatory nature. So at the start of the play, Eric is presented as immature and childlike. He's talked to by his father like a child. "Just listen here, Eric." Lots of phrases that are sort of controlling and manipulative. The quotations I went for are, "I suddenly just felt I had to laugh," and "the sort of state where a chap easily turns nasty." one of which showing his lack of emotional maturity, that in the dinner party, which is celebrating his sister's engagement, he just feels he has to laugh. There's some sort of, if he sees a ridiculousness in what is going on, if you like. He just described as squiffy, and the fact that he can't control himself, he drinks too much. He tries to excuse his behaviour. He uses euphemisms like the sort of state where a chap easily turns nasty, rather than ultimately giving a true version of events, if you like. He's trying to excuse his behaviour, and he ties himself in knots in that way. However, Eric absorbs the message, and he is genuinely sorry and sorrowful for what he's done. When the inspector leaves, he says, "The girl's still dead, isn't she? I did what I did." Accepting responsibility, accepting blame. When his father says, "You might go to prison," he says, "I don't care. I will. If that's what has to happen, that's what has to happen. I accept the responsibility, and I'm accepting that I'm to blame for this." "We all helped to kill her" is an important phrase. The fact that he's unifying them all and reminding the characters, using the inspector's words and reflecting them in parallel to show how he's absorbing the message and responding to this. So Eric, like Sheila, is one of those, the younger generation, who takes the inspector's message on board and will absorb it, and it will affect his behaviour and his values for the future. Okay, for you to do today, I have I'm going to post the full plan that I've done here, showing every character with the 2 sets of quotations for each of them, looking at some quotations from their state of innocence, where they do not understand and have not received the inspector's message, and then a few states of experience once they've absorbed the message, and if they do decide to make changes or not. Like I said at the start of the video, it's important to have quotations from lots of different parts of the play to demonstrate characters changing and developing, or not changing and not developing, which is almost as important. So showing that you understand the whole play, and examiners will be looking for that. So what I'd like you to do for me is to have a look at each of the characters and try and consider how they change or don't change across the play, looking at least 2 quotations. And then if you want to have a look at my plan to help you and support you, obviously you can take a screen grab of that, or it'll be available via Google Classroom. Have a look at that, and then if you stay tuned at the end of today, we'll have today's film recommendation for you. Okay, for today's film recommendation, I've gone for a film that is a very important film for the times that we're living in. It's a very difficult watch, and it's one that it's aged particularly well, and that's American History X. It follows the story of a neo-Nazi and his younger brother, and their descent into the culture of that group and white supremacy, and the revelations that take place, and the values and how they shift and how they change, and how the older brother, his interactions with the black community while in prison, change his values and his beliefs. It is a very, very difficult watch, and there are some really upsetting scenes in it, but it's a very, very important film. And there's a scene around the dinner table which reads as if it was shot yesterday. So it's a fantastic film to watch. Really, really interesting messages and interesting ideas, but not an easy one. So next time with Inspector Calls, we're going to potentially be looking at doing some further looking at symbolism and motifs throughout the play. Until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you for the next one.